Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Monica Pica with Sachs Healthcare, and I'll be your technical producer for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar is being recorded. You may ask a question at any time during the presentation by typing your question into the Q&A box located on the right side of your screen and pressing Enter. Our speakers will try to answer as many questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Also, at the bottom of your screen, you can find the Handouts tab. If you experience technical difficulties, please use the Tech Support tab, also located on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you have trouble seeing the slides at any time during the presentation, please press F5 to refresh your screen if you're using a PC, or Command R if you're using a Mac. Please make sure you are not behind a firewall, as this will prevent you from viewing the presentation. Our moderator today is Lexi Caraway. Lexi is currently a senior patient trainer for Hillrom and the former manager of respiratory at Sarah Bush Lincoln Health Center in Mattoon, Illinois. Her department participated in the survey mentioned in the recent study, Prevalence of Burnout Among Respiratory Therapists Amidst the COVID-19 Pandemic. Lexi has published several abstracts at AARC Congress, including a study on thermographic imaging to detect and prevent pressure injuries. She has presented at several local and state respiratory care conferences. Welcome.
Thank you, Monica, for that very kind introduction. The title of today's webinar is Battling Burnout in Respiratory Care. We are excited to introduce a leading expert in this very critical area, Andrew Miller. Mr. Miller is currently a pediatric respiratory care practitioner, ECMO specialist, and charge therapist at Duke University Medical Center. He has been a member of the AARC since 2006 and was inducted as a fellow of the AARC in 2020. He is the author of over 50 peer-reviewed publications and has lectured on a variety of respiratory care topics, including multiple publications related to burnout. His most recent published respiratory care article, entitled Prevalence of Burnout Among Respiratory Care Therapists Amid the COVID-19 Pandemic. The speaker has disclosed the following relevant financial relationship. He is the section editor for respiratory care. This educational activity is approved for 1 contact hour for nurses and respiratory therapists. A link to obtain credit will be available at the end of the webinar. Support for this educational activity has been provided by Philips. And at this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Mr. Andrew Miller.
All right, thank you, Lexi, for that excellent introduction. And the title of my talk is going to be Battling Burnout in Respiratory Care. First off, we'll talk about our learning objectives. So we're going to define burnout. We're going to identify what drives burnout. We're going to discuss the prevalence of burnout. We're going to discuss the consequences of burnout, which is, as most of you can imagine, is mostly negative. And then finally, we're going to learn a little bit about what we can do about burnout. So what is burnout? So a lot of us think about burnout, at least from my generation. We think about, the guys from Nirvana, Spicoli, Big Lebowski. We think of these people as kind of burnouts. And then you have, Fat Thor from the recent Avengers movie, although he probably more has PTSD versus burnout. But then I also live in the South now, so sometimes we think of burnout more as like this, where you have somebody doing a burnout. And then at work, sometimes when we're burned out, we kind of feel like this, where we're kind of asking for help and nobody's recognizing that we need help and we're overloaded. But I think this particular meme kind of really sums it up for me, is where if you're a respiratory therapist or a nurse or whatever your job is, you've worked 3 tough shifts in a row. At the end of your 3 shifts, you're really struggling to have empathy, and you're just you're tired, you're exhausted, you're really kind of worn out emotionally from 3 shifts in a row. And I think that's been exacerbated by COVID, given the high acuity and the high rates of death that we've seen. And I think when we talk about burnout, it's when you actually are feeling that way all the time. It's not related to, a couple bad shifts in a row. You're kind of in that space all the time. And it's kind of hard to have enough energy to come back the next day. When when we talk about burnout prevalence, we'll go over this a little bit more in detail coming up. But you can see this nice group of healthcare workers. There's 8 of them here. And based on pre-COVID data, what we have is kind of, 1, 2, 3, 4. So about 4 out of those 8 were suffering from burnout. So post-COVID, it's a little bit higher. Some of the data I'll show you on RTs is much higher than that. It's more closer to 6 out of 8. And then we're gonna move on and how I'm gonna define burnout. So this is how burnout's been classically defined. It's kind of a boring, dry definition. So we have the 3 pillars of burnout, which is emotional exhaustion, depersonalization or cynicism. That's where you're no longer seeing your patients as people, you're seeing them as kind of objects. So instead of saying we're going to go see Mr. Smith in room 42, it's that guy in room 42, and that decreases the quality of care and decreases your engagement and decreases the patient's kind of overall experience. And then professional inefficacy. So this is where you're just not, no matter what you accomplish or how things are going, you just don't feel like you're doing a good job. And I think it's really important that, so this graphic kind of shows that when you have all 3 of these, they kind of intersect and you end up with burnout. But what really is the most important driver here is the emotional exhaustion piece. So if you were to draw those based on how big of an impact they have on burnout, the emotional exhaustion bubble would be much, much bigger. And then the Duke Safety Center, so a lot of this content comes from their work. They define it a little bit simpler. They say burnout at its core is it's the impaired ability to experience positive emotions. So when things are going well, you can't notice those things. So everything, like, so you get a neutral email, you interpret as a negative, etc. You get a positive email, you interpret as neutral, and kind of everything, today sucked, yesterday sucked, and tomorrow's going to suck. When in reality, if you really think about it or dig deeper, those days they don't suck. They're just kind of normal days. And so what is burnout? So what happens in burnout is that it's where our ability to, we all have high stress jobs in healthcare. So you have this much stress and your ability to cope is usually, right even with it. But what happens over time is sometimes the stress is higher. And what you end up with is a little bit over time, it just kind of wears you down. So it's kind of like, a drop of water, a drop of water, a drop of water. And over time, a drop of water can break a pretty strong rock. So it's one of those things where very rarely that somebody gets burned out because of one acute event. Usually it's a lot of small events that have added up over time, and it's related to psychology, which we're going to talk about coming up, and then also some systems problems that we can hopefully address in the future. And before we talk about what burnout really is and the psychology burnout, I really want to go over briefly what burnout isn't. So a lot of times it's misunderstood of what burnout is. So it's not a personal failing. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not that you don't have enough resilience, which is one of the reasons why getting people a pizza party or teaching them to do yoga doesn't have a huge impact on burnout rates. It's not a mental illness. It's a specifically work-related phenomenon that's overlaps a little bit with depression and anxiety, but is a distinct entity that's kind of different than those. It's not easily solvable. So there's some people will say, we'll just get more staff and the burnout will be better. And that's not necessarily case, and then it's not an individual problem. So we have to look at it as a system problem and not necessarily individual failing. So you're not going to solve this by having a few pizza parties, teaching people how to do yoga, or even teaching people mindfulness strategies. Those might help individuals, but they're not going to solve the problem as a whole. So the psychology of burnout. So it's really important that we understand kind of why people are prone to burnout, and it's really related to evolution. So what happens is over time, our negative stimuli in our environment are very powerful. So you think of a rattlesnake or some other thing that is life-threatening. So if our ancestors had responded to this saber-toothed tiger without, fear and running away, we wouldn't be here, right? So our species would not have evolved. We would have all been eaten by lions and tigers and bears. And I think it's really important that when we talk about these things, that's why the negative kind of fight and flight instincts are much more powerful than positive emotions. So if you look back at our, if our ancestors had been hanging out on the beach watching these beautiful sunsets, they would have probably felt better, but we wouldn't exist, right? Because they would have been eaten by a predator. And of course, now in the modern society, we don't, at least where I live, we don't have a whole lot of saber-toothed tigers or lions and tigers and bears running around. So we don't have a lot of, clear threats to our survival, but our body and our brains don't know that. So they treat everyday stimuli sometimes as a life-threatening threat. So you see this in road rage, right? So I feel like we don't see it in the news as much as we used to, but you know, we do still see road rage, right? Where people have this kind of crazy response to traffic or somebody cutting them off or somebody flipping them the bird or whatever it is that made them angry. And that's because these people have those same fight or flight instincts. So their brain thinks that their life is at risk, and then they'll respond by fighting. And we talk about fight and flight. Some people will also freeze. And then it's important that some people can't really regulate these emotions, especially if they're under a lot of stress. And finally, the thing that we see probably most often in healthcare is that you're going to deal with a rude colleague. So somebody's going to come and yell at you or tell you you're stupid or belittle your accomplishments, and you're going to have that same kind of physiologic, instinctual response. It's not something that you can necessarily control, but you can learn how to recognize those emotions so that you don't react negatively. And then one of the things that we run into is our perceptions of individual situations greatly influence how we feel. So like I was saying earlier, if you're burned out, you kind of view everything negatively. So one of the things we teach is during this course, if it's in person, is we have people shout out what they think these drawings are. Because when you're burned out or you're in a negative space, like even if you're depressed, you only see the negative aspects of this thing. So this drawing, normally I would just pop it up and have people shout out what they think it is. And this is my favorite because no matter how many times I see this one, I always see the alligator, but it can also be a nice friendly squirrel. So depending on the space that you're in is going to depend on how you perceive things to be. And that refers to interactions with colleagues, emails, work, patient outcomes. All those things are very dependent on our viewpoint. And when you're burned out, like I said, you're in that kind of space where everything is bad. Another way to think about this is as we think of kind of our emotional resilience as a battery, right? So you're here, you just came back from a great vacation, you really, got an irritating nurse, but it's not bothering you. You're going out, you're crushing it, you're getting all your treatments done on time, you're dishing out high fives in the hallway, and everybody's having a great day. And then what happens over time is your battery starts to get a little bit depleted due to that, just natural stress of work. You end up you start off here, and then as you get kind of worn down a little bit, you end up kind of here. You're not quite as happy. And then, as you get really drained, you're grumpy. So now here you're in this kind of space where, maybe you have that same irritating nurse, but now you're kind of being short with her on the phone, or you're kind of acting judgmental, or your body language isn't quite up to the standard that you like it to be. And then finally, when you get pushed over the edge, when you're burned out and you don't take enough time to recharge your batteries, you end up going full Hulk on somebody in the hallway, and you end up with a little chair time with the boss, or even maybe some paid time off to go to anger management, depending on how much stuff you smash in the hallway. Hopefully no one's actually smashing things. These are kind of extreme examples to kind of illustrate kind of what can happen if you don't take good care of yourself, or if you don't identify all of the issues that are driving burnout. One of the other things that drives burnout is this sense of kind of loss of connection. So this is mostly pre-COVID data. So what we found is, or not we, what they found is that about 40% of Americans report that they feel lonely, either sometimes or all the time. And what's really interesting about this data is that people that don't have good social connections are actually at a higher risk of having heart attacks and strokes. And then what's really interesting is that people with strong social connections actually live about 50% longer. So I think there was a big fad about 10 years ago, it's probably still going on, about the Mediterranean diet, and how all the people that lived on the Mediterranean, they had a really good life expectancy, but not only a good life expectancy, but they were extremely healthy even into old age. And I think what they've discovered over the past, 10 years or 5 years or so, that it's actually they have these really, really strong social connections in those communities. Like all the people they're constantly at their neighbor's house, playing cards and having tea and meeting for snacks and going out to dinner, and they're constantly socializing. They have these really powerful social bonds. And I think that is something that is a major driver of why those people do so well. And then all of these issues are exacerbated by the pandemic. Hopefully, we're getting towards the end of the pandemic, but this was really hard early on, where you're basically stuck in your house for, several months, depending, or longer, depending on where you live. And it's also, I don't want to talk too much about social media, but I think we have to talk about it some, because when we talk about meaningful connections, like I was talking about in the previous slide, have as strong of an effect, positive effect, as smoking has a negative effect. You really want to try to cultivate these relationships if you can. And then, of course, social media is not a substitute for real connection. So what you do is your brain gets a little dopamine buzz every time you get a like or a reply or a retweet. But you have to be really careful about social media, because it's really not a healthy comparison. So everyone's putting their absolutely best self forward. So all those people that, they have a perfect family, they're on all these great vacations. They took 30 pictures of their kid, having a meltdown, and to get the one that they put on social media. So their life is just like your life. And I think it creates this kind of sense that, you get FOMO, or fear of missing out, or things like that. And then I think these two memes that I'm going to show you really kind of illustrate. So you see Meg Griffin from Family Guy on Instagram, and then her in real life, and then this other one with, introverted people, which is, someone like me, is that, you see me on social media and I'm doing all these things, but in real life sometimes I'm just hanging out with a hoodie reading a book. A little bit more on loss of connection. So pre-pandemic, people were spending an average of 2 hours and 22 minutes on social media. I think for us in the hospital, when we have to do a lot of charting and things, we probably spend even more than that, on the computer systems, checking email, charting, looking at x-rays, looking at labs, and all of those types of things. And I think Albert Einstein has a very nice quote that kind of summarizes this, to say, and he said, "I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction. The world will have a generation of idiots." So I think if Albert Einstein saw this picture over here on the left, where you've got 5 young people out to dinner and all 5 are on their cell phones, I assume, it looks like a couple of them are taking pictures for their Instagram and a couple are tweeting. Instead of interacting with each other, they're actually interacting with a virtual world, which isn't nearly as meaningful of a connection. So one thing that, pre-pandemic, I don't go out as much as I did before, but one thing that we used to do was that, whoever got their cell phone out first at dinner had to pay for all the drinks, which puts a pretty powerful incentive on people to try to interact with each other instead of focusing on their phone. I think when we talk about, the psychology of burnout, and we talked a lot about negative and positive interactions. So it's one of those things that positive interactions can counteract negative interactions, but unfortunately it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. So you can't just give somebody a compliment right after you yelled at them and everything will be fine. So this ratio actually needs to be at least 3-to-1 for people to kind of counteract a negative interaction. And then there's actually some fairly good studies from the business world that shows that to really get your team to thrive, what you want is this ratio to be more like 8-to-1 or even 10-to-1. And then after that, it kind of plateaus out. But you really want to, I wouldn't say bombard, but you really want to focus on getting people positive feedback and really telling them when they do a good job. At least everywhere I've worked, we do things correctly 99.5% of the time, or higher than that. But the only things we tend to hear about is when we mess up. So it's really good to hear when we do things well. I think this experiment is really an interesting way to kind of describe kind of the physiology of why this happens. So this is a really good, it's over 20 years old experiment where they took participants and they put them in an anxiety provoking situation. So I think they had somebody come yell at them, and then they showed them various short videos that express different emotions. So you say something amusing, something content, something kind of neutral, and something with a negative emotion. So they showed something sad. Then they measured how long it took people's heart rates and blood pressures to come back to normal. And what they found is that if you watch something with the positive emotions, you recover faster than if you watch something negative. And one of the things I always talk about is that this is a common evaluations tactic. Hopefully it's going away, because it doesn't really work. But you think of the feedback sandwich, where you get a positive comment, constructive criticism, and then another positive comment. But I don't think that that's very effective, because what happens is everyone is just laser focused on that middle part, and they don't really hear the positive things. So if you're the boss and you do evaluations, what you really want to focus on is giving people positive feedback all the time. Because I think one of the worst possible outcomes if you're the boss is that you only come around to talk to people when they mess up, then they become afraid of you and they associate you with kind of negative outcomes and punishment. And you want to avoid that because it's going to prevent your team from having good psychological safety and hurt you with problem. And then this is just a summary. So it's important to remember that positive emotions and appropriate self-care can kind of recharge your batteries. So it's important to make sure you do things that recharge your batteries, including taking days off and unplugging from email when you're not at the hospital. Then another thing that we have to talk about with burnout is that burnout can be contagious. So I think it's really important. I think we all understand that emotions can be contagious. The best example that I can give of this is if you've ever been in a code or emergency situation and somebody comes in that is freaking out, what happens to the rest of the team, right? Everybody else gets amped up and freaks out. And I think that, and vice versa, right? So if everybody's kind of running around with their heads cut off and somebody comes and takes control and is calm and clear, it kind of brings everybody, calms everybody down. And I think it's really important that not even just a situation like that, but burnout can be contagious in nurses. So what they do is they do these very large studies of big healthcare systems. And what they find is that burnout tends to be clustered in individual work units. So there's some, they match, like the characteristics are very similar, but unit A has a high level of burnout, unit B has a lower level of burnout, and they think that's because burnout is contagious. So they think that one or two people get burned out and then it drags kind of the whole team down. It's also important that the social contagion and group norms are really powerful. So if you have a team that really works well together, good safety culture, is willing and able to give each other good feedback, and has a good leadership, those teams are going to be very successful. But that's a double-edged sword. So if you have a team that's cynical and burn out, you can put your new go-getters with them, but what's most likely going to happen is that the burned out people are going to drag the new people down, as opposed to the enthusiastic people pulling the burned out people up. So now we're going to switch and talk about how common burnout is. So in physicians, it's around 50%. It's probably actually a little bit higher than that post-COVID, but it varies quite a bit based on specialty. Critical care nurses, again, around half. 2 out of 3 critical care nurses have trouble sleeping. About a quarter are clinically depressed. And then rates of PTSD are actually a little bit higher than what we see in veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. So critical care nurses are actually at a higher risk of PTSD than soldiers returning from active combat zones. So it's something to note when you're working with some of your nursing or some of our nursing colleagues that are struggling. And then burnout wise in RTs, we don't have great data. I'm going to show you the results from our study that is the biggest study to date, but there are some earlier studies that show, severe burnout in over a quarter of RTs, and then about half had emotional exhaustion. But that's kind of like a subgroup of a bigger study, and it wasn't a very large number of RTs. And then it's really important that medical students and residents have reported a 44% burnout rate. So that means people that are still in training who haven't even started practicing are suffering from burnout. So our system is so hard on them that they're actually burned out before they actually start practicing. And I think it's really important that medical students in particular, they actually have higher resilience and better overall well-being when they start medical school than they do compared to their peers that go to other graduate level programs. So there's something in the system that is burning these people out. And then most recently during COVID, this paper was just published in JAMA in the last few months, and they found that interns, so I think as RTs, we complain a lot about our workload, but you should spend some time with an intern. They work huge amounts of hours, and their workload is astronomically high. So make sure you be kind to these folks. If they put in a pointless albuterol order, try not to yell at them. But they had a 92% rate of burnout after 6 months on the job, and that's despite some interventions to help them. And so the RT prevalence, so this is from our study that was published in November. I should have updated this slide, but we surveyed people last year from January to March, and we had over 1,000 responses. The response rate was 37%. So for this type of work, we'd like it to be a little bit higher. So we'd like it to be more like 50 to 60%, because if the response rate's too low, what you end up happening is is you probably have a little bit of an overestimation of the true burnout rate, because people that are especially burned out or especially interested in burnout are more likely to respond to your survey. And then what's really important here is that at the department level, so one department had a 100% burnout rate, so every single person that responded to our survey reported burnout. But then the department that was doing the best was still at 53%. So even the department that was doing well, and they had very high leadership scores, and it was one of the children's hospitals that wasn't getting hit hard with COVID, their burnout rate was still over 50%. So we've got a big problem that we need to work to solve. And then you can see here the demographics of the hospitals. These are fairly large on average. We tried really hard to get 5 community hospitals, 5 academic centers, and then 5 standalone children's hospitals, and we ended up with 26 centers, which we think are a reasonably representative sample of RTs at large. And so these are the questions that we ask to determine if people are burned out. So you ask people, I feel burned out. Events in this work setting affect me in an emotionally unhealthy way. I'm tired when I have to come up and face another day on the job. I feel frustrated by my job. I'm working too hard at my job. And then people in this work setting, so we define this as the respiratory care department. But like I said earlier, the respiratory therapists could be very much influenced by their work setting beyond the respiratory care department. So if you're going to an ICU that's been bludgeoned with COVID for the past 2.5 years, all those people are burned out. It's likely that that's going to have a negative effect on the RTs, and then the RTs could potentially bring that burnout to the respiratory department, and then it becomes this kind of circle that you can't kind of break, where everybody's suffering from burnout. And then to determine the burnout climate, the full survey asks the opposite of all these questions, where it says people are burned out. We just asked a single question: do you think people are burned out that you're working with? And then for leadership, again, we asked 5 questions. So my manager director is available at predictable times. They provide regular feedback to me. They provide positive feedback to me, and then they give me useful feedback. And so what we found is that the RT burnout rate in our study was 79%, and 37% had mild burnout, 32% moderate, and then 10% severe. What we found is when we compared those with burnout to those that didn't have burnout, those who were burned out, they work more hours. They work more hours in the ICU. They're more likely to care for adult patients, which is probably a reflection of COVID exposure. And then they provided a lot of care via RT protocol. Then they consistently reported inadequate staffing, that they weren't able to complete all of their work. They were frequently exposed to COVID, which I already said. They had kind of a more negative view of their leadership. And then most importantly, they were more likely to miss work. Then in our logistic regression model for things that predict burnout, so these are in a large sample size, you're going to find a lot of things that are statistically significant, but that doesn't mean that they're kind of true signals of what's driving burnout. So we do a multivariable logistic regression to kind of control for all of these things, and we see what's kind of independently associated with burnout. And what we found was the number one predictor of an individual being burned out is whether or not they said that the other people in their work area were burned out. So people who think that the other RTs are burned out are 9.4 times more likely to be burned out. And those working without adequate staffing were 2.1 to 3.2 times more likely to be burned out. Then if you weren't able to complete all of your work, you were 2.1 to 5.6 times more likely to be burned out. And then things that we found that were protective against burnout. So if you had a positive view of your leadership, you were less likely to be burned out. We currently have a paper under peer review kind of evaluating factors that are associated with a positive or negative view of leadership. So hopefully that paper will be out soon. And then one thing that was the most protective against burnout was not providing patient care. So this is one of those things where the leadership teams who aren't at the bedside were the least likely to be burned out. And then finally, even after controlling for all of our variables, people who were burned out were twice as likely to miss work for any reason. So prevalence by itself doesn't really give us a whole lot of great information, right? So you can't solve a problem by simply saying that it exists, right? So you have to find out what drives burnout. So one of the things that drives physician burnout is going to be very similar to what drives burnout in RTs and nurses, right? So high workloads, you have all of these other things, poor teamwork, I'm not going to read all of these, but increased clerical burden, individual factors. So there's some people that are going to be more or less prone to burnout, moral distress, end of life care. So I think that's a big one in RTs, but it's a hard thing to study as to separating out that from other things. Inefficient work processes, and then finally organizational factors. So one of the biggest drivers is going to be organizational factors. So how things are organized and how things are done, and then leadership is going to have a big impact on how the organization is run, but also at the individual level can have a big impact on an individual employee's well-being. So if your boss doesn't treat you with respect and doesn't listen to you, you're going to have a more negative kind of work experience, and that probably makes you more likely to be burned out. And drivers of nursing, these should look pretty familiar because they're basically almost identical to what we see in physicians. And again, inefficient staffing, which is related to inadequate staffing and lots of nursing turnover, high workloads, poor teamwork, having to rotate shifts, which creates a lot of stress. Organizational factors, again, poor leadership is a big driver of this, and then just kind of lack of support from, or not lack of support is probably the last right word, but kind of imperfect leadership is probably a good way to say it. And then not getting lunch breaks, too many things going on. I work at a large academic center, and the number of projects going on is astronomically high, and then the bedside nurses hard time keeping up. And so drivers in RTs, so we don't have as good a data as we have in nurses and physicians, but they're going to be similar. So you can see here on this, move forward here. All of them are on here. So we say, the drivers of burnout, again, you're going to have staffing. So you don't have enough staff, which means you can't complete all your work. You're going to have a high workload, which is related to staffing, but it's a little bit different. Sometimes it's not a staffing thing. Sometimes it's this is how we built our system, and this is the amount of work that we expect you to be able to do. And it may be too high for some people. Kind of depends how you determine FTEs and work units and things like that. And then the other things that we found pretty consistently is the physical and emotional toll, which has obviously been worsened by COVID. But it's really important that when we talk about COVID, that all of these problems existed before COVID, and COVID just made them worse or brought them to the forefront. And then you can see here in our initial study, which was on resilience resources in respiratory care departments, you can see the top 3 reasons that people thought RTs were burned out was due to poor leadership, poor staffing, and then high workload. Which has been confirmed in a couple other qualitative studies. And then the one thing that's missing that people where I work complain about all the time, and everywhere I've worked people complain about it, is pay. And so when we do these big studies, it's pretty consistent that they don't identify pay as a major driver of burnout. Now, that might be a little bit different now that the travelers are making so much money, but I think in general, once you have enough money to kind of pay your rent or your mortgage, and you have a house and you have enough food, more money doesn't have as big of an impact on your overall well-being as you would think it would. So when we asked on the previous slide, what percentage of people think pay is a driver of burnout, it was like 3 or 4%. So it was very low. It's not something that has been shown in the nursing or physician leadership either. And then I'm preaching to the choir here with a group of RTs, but COVID had a significant effect on us, right? So we got a lot of critically ill patients all at once. Some systems were really overwhelmed. They had to ask non-RTs to do respiratory care, including medical students in some places, CRNAs, floor nurses. There's some places that had to turn their floors into ICUs acutely. There was a lot of shortages of PPE. There was a lot of unknowns with COVID at first, which made it very, anxiety provoking to taking care of these patients because you didn't know what the risks were. There was a shortage of ventilators, although I'm not aware of any places that really consistently ran out of ventilators. That was a big concern at first, but things seem to be okay in terms of the number of ventilators. The bigger problem seems to be not enough qualified staff or not enough staff. And then I think it's really important to say that this exacerbated existing staffing shortages. So most departments were already running shorthanded, and a lot of places were running with this concept that I saw on social media where they described it as the whole system is built on just enough, right? So, you have just enough RTs, you have just enough ventilator circuits, you have just enough ventilators, and we're really not well prepared for these surges and these pandemics or mass casualty events. And that's true across the board. There's very few systems that are prepared for that. But I think when you suddenly have this huge influx of patients and you don't have enough staff already, and suddenly the ventilator workload has gone up by 3 or 4 times, you're just not equipped to handle that. And that's a huge amount of stress for people to kind of overcome short term. And then initially, people were taking travel assignments to go kind of help out. And I think early on, it was a really noble enterprise that people wanted to go to these hotspots so that they could help out. But I think what's happened is that we've ended up having an arms race for travelers or agency staff, and they're making 2 to 3 times what they made previously, or in some cases you have people making 4 to 5 times what they were making previously, and you really can't begrudge those people for taking that money. But what happens is it leaves the home facilities shorthanded. Then even the places where the travelers go, we've had quite a few travelers at our facility, and most of them are fantastic, but they don't have the same level of kind of ownership and engagement that we expect from our regular staff. So it probably weakens the individual systems a little bit. And then how COVID impacted burnout. So the HERO registry, which was a very large study done through various critical care societies, this was an interesting study that found, this was fairly early on in the pandemic, and they found that RTs had the second highest COVID exposure, but didn't seem to have an increased risk of burnout compared to other professions. And then in most of these studies, you can see here in the Netherlands, burnout increased from 23 to 36%. But you have to look, when you compare them to the numbers I shared earlier, the Netherlands, they're doing pretty good, right? Their burnout rate's only 23%, whereas most of the data I've shown you has been up in the 50s. I think they were doing a really nice job in the Netherlands. And then Portugal, they're a little bit over half. And then one of the things that's driving burnout up is moral distress related to high workloads and high death rates, and then care limitations where you feel like you can't help the patients because they're so sick. But early on, it was this feeling of helplessness, and then now it's become, vaccination has become very political and controversial for some people. So it creates a lot of emotional distress when people say these people are all unvaccinated and they could have prevented this critical illness by getting the vaccine. So I think that creates a lot of moral distress and frustration among staff. And then most of the studies that have been published have shown burnouts increase, around 7 to 10% during the pandemic. So if we apply this to our fairly large study, you would say pre-COVID, the burnout rates for RTs were, close to 70%, which is where we need to do better. So now we'll switch to what are the negative personal consequences of burnout. So your life's going to be worse, right? I think that that's pretty obvious for anyone who's paying attention, but you're going to have worse work-life balance. You're going to have lower quality relationships. You're not going to live as long. You're more likely to get hurt. You're more likely to get hurt. And this final one is kind of surprising, but sort of makes sense when you're under a lot of stress, that you're more likely to get traffic tickets and get into traffic. And I think this kind of graphic or this cartoon really sums up how many of our leaders feel, or people that the highly dedicated people, where you're at work, you're exhausted, you can't wait to go home and go to sleep, and then you finally go home and go to sleep, and then all of a sudden you're thinking about work and you're struggling to get a good night's sleep. And what happens to our patients? So that's why we're in this business, right? Is that we're all about taking care of the patients the best we can, and even sometimes kind of at the expense of our own well-being. And when the staff are burned out, the patients also do worse, right? So you're more likely to get infections. The patients aren't as happy with their care. There's more errors. There's more safety events. Overall care is worse. And then when you compare mortality in nursing units that have high levels of burnout to those that have low levels of burnout, they're actually, the mortality rates are higher in the places with burnout. We don't have any data in RTs, but presumably these effects are very similar in RT departments. And this is just a graphical way to talk about what I just discussed on the previous slide. You can see it's divided really nicely into your personal consequences, so broken relationships. It's really important to remember that alcohol and drugs, so having a couple glasses of wine after work is probably not an appropriate coping mechanism. You're more likely to be depressed. commit suicide. And then this says physician turnover, but this you could replace physician with RT or nurse or PT or pretty much any physician, any profession here. You're going to have more turnover, which increases costs, which decreases the quality of care, and also increases the stress on your existing staff because they have to train all of these new people. Then people aren't as productive, they make more mistakes, and the patients aren't as happy with the. And then one of the questions is kind of who is susceptible to burnout. So one of the things that's important is to remember that the people who are probably most susceptible to burnout are going to be those hard chargers, those people that they're volunteering for everything, they're picking up extra shifts, they're doing extra stuff, they're always trying to do more stuff. You have to kind of keep an eye on those people to make sure that they don't overextend themselves, because it's real easy to go from this kind of I'm trying to do all these things to burnout, and it can become all of a sudden someone can be overwhelmed, and if there isn't a support system in place to detect that or help the people, it can be very frustrating. So you can see here you have Thor early on, he's really crushing it, and then here you have Thor after a few years, now he can barely get off of his chair. And I think what you want to do is you want to catch people, kind of like when I showed this slide about the batteries, where you really want to catch people while they're still in the yellow, because it can be really hard to pull people back when they've already reached that state of burnout or PTSD. So now we've got about, I don't know, 20 minutes left or so. Really want to talk about the things that we can do. So I probably made you all pretty depressed about burnout and how terrible it is. But the nice thing is there are some strategies that have been shown to work, and there's a lot of work being done right now to try to identify other things that can be done to help burnout. So most of these focus on cultivating positive emotions or increasing the quality and the quantity of personal connections. So like I went to this course on burnout. A lot of the activities are all about creating connections with people, which has become increasingly difficult with the pandemic. So a lot of these activities are like, having a handshake for 1 minute while making eye contact. So no one wants to do that anymore because of COVID. So now we have to try to figure out other ways to make these connections. And one of the big things, I'm not going to talk about it in depth here, but you really want to make sure that you take good care of yourself. I think that's one of the things that some of those hard chargers that I was talking about on the previous slide don't always do, right? So they don't get enough sleep, they don't drink enough water, they don't make sure they take their breaks, they don't disconnect from work when they're at home, they're always on their email, they're always responding to emails. So I think you have to really make sure that people draw that line. And so if you're in a leadership position, you want to make sure you model the behavior you want. So you want to make sure that no one feels like they have to respond to emails when they're not at work. And then finally, when I talk about other things that help, a lot of it is dealing with negative emotions. These all at the Duke Center for Healthcare Equality. But before I talk about individual strategies, which is where a lot of the focus has been to date, because those are a lot easier to do. It's easier to enroll individuals in studies to see if we can make them more resilient than it is to enroll an organization to see if you can beat burnout throughout. One of the keys is you have to measure burnout, right? So you can't just say, oh no, our burnout rates are good and we're doing fine, because our initial study found that only 10% of departments actually measured burnout. And then when we asked them to estimate what their burnout rates were, they weren't even close. So you can see here on the graph, or hopefully you can see it, it's kind of small on my screen. We found that 79% of people were burned out, right? So they should all be in this red box on the bottom, but only 20% of the people correctly estimated that that's what their burnout rates were. They were way off. So probably just saying, I think my people are doing fine is not good enough. You have to actually measure it. And then there's a significant relationship between leadership and burnout, but it's important to remember that we don't know what is causative there. So we don't know poor leadership drives burnout, or vice versa. People who are burned out are mad at their leaders and kind of blaming them to say, my life stinks because my boss is a jerk, right? Like, which is, for the most part, probably not true. But I think there's definitely a relationship there, and leadership behavior is something that's, not relatively easily, but is potentially modifiable in terms of impacting burnout and improving people's kind of overall engagement. Then the other things that kind of go without saying is that we have to address our staffing shortages. So we need our schools to turn out more respiratory therapists. We need people to kind of stay in the profession longer. I think COVID and stuff is probably driving some people to retire early or to consider other employment. And then we want to make sure that we equitably distribute the workload. So we want to make sure that, like those hard chargers that I was talking about a couple of slides ago, you want to make sure that they're not having to do more than their fair share of the work every single day, because over time that's going to kind of wear them down, and it's going to be satisfied with their job, eventually make them go work someplace else or choose another profession. And one big strategy that has been demonstrated to be effective in terms of organizational strategies is what we talk about, call it leadership rounding. So basically, as a leader, you walk around and you talk to people, and it's really important that it's not just going around and talking to people. It's actually going around and talking to people and getting feedback in both directions. So a lot of times what I've observed is you've got a leader with a shirt and tie walking around going, "Hey, you're doing a great job," and "Hey, you're doing a great job," but there's no back and forth there. It's just performative, right? There's no substance there. What you really want is the leaders to go around and really listen to what the people say. And when you have people where the leaders go around and they really are engaged and they listen and they're engaged with the staff, you have better safety culture, more workplace engagement, lower burnout. And like I said in the previous studies, burnout tends to be clustered in individual work settings, largely due to the fact that it's contagious. A little bit more on leadership rounding. So like I mentioned previously, the feedback really needs to be bi-directional. And it's really important that your leaders, they model the behavior that you want. They actively listen. I think this is a big problem. It's something that I struggle with every day, that I sometimes spend more time thinking about what I want to say versus listening and really understanding what people are telling me. You want your leaders to implement suggestions, and then make sure they give credit to staff. So if somebody comes up with a good idea, you want to make sure that Bill gets credit for his great idea and not the boss taking credit for Bill's idea, because stealing, or not stealing, but not giving credit where credit's due can be demoralizing for staff and have a negative effect on their well-being and their engagement level. So if people don't get credit for their work, they're probably less likely to bring ideas forward in the future. And like I talked about when we talked about positive versus negative feedback, really want to focus on giving people specific positive feedback, and it also has to be frequent, right? So you really want to try to talk to people, at least 60% of your staff, right, every month. And then you want to make sure that they have psychological safety. So we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable speaking up and talking about things that concern them. And then specific strategies that can help. If there's a slide that you want to take a screenshot of or really share, it's this one. So this is the Duke Center for Healthcare Quality and Safety. They have 18 tools that are all free to use. I was going to talk about 3, but I've been a little long-winded, so we don't have time to talk about all of them, but we'll talk about a couple. It'll give you some ideas for self-care. And then it's also important to remember that we have a lot of local resources that can be very helpful. So that's social workers, chaplains, employee assistance programs. A lot of places have employee assistance programs, so you can get plugged into those if you're struggling with burnout. But it doesn't have to be work-related. They will help you with non-work-related things, and they can help plug you into some resources. So when you have a high burnout rate, one of the things is trying to pick which activities that you really want to start with. So this is usually the first activity that people do. It's called 3 good things. And what you do is at the end of each day, you write down 3 good things that happened each day. And so this is from one of our units that had a really high burnout rate and kind of low morale. They did this for like 3 or 4 weeks. And it's actually very interesting and helpful because put everybody's 3 good things up on a board. And it's really nice because it's cheap, it's very low resources, and it's pretty easy. So the question is, for these things that are so simple, is how well do they work? So this one actually works pretty well. So this is from the Duke Safety Center, folks. And you can see here, just doing this simple activity for 2 or 3 weeks increases happiness, decreases burnout, improves work-life balance, decreases depression. And what's really important about this particular study is that the effects actually last 12 months. So you do this activity for a few minutes, for 2 weeks, a few minutes a day for 2 weeks, and then it works really well and it helps you for a month. And this is one of the activities that is often used to kind of prime the pump, so to speak. I'm going to skip the examples because we're running short on time. And I want to talk very briefly about mindfulness. So this is something that you're going to see a lot in the literature, but it's a really more complicated than it's made out a lot of the times. So it's basically this sense of being fully aware and present and accepting what's happening around you without judgment. So a lot of times we're thinking about the past and we're thinking about the future, And if you're like me, you spend a lot of your time kind of all over the place, like this puppy, running from place to place. I think let's skip the slide in the interest of time. And what's interesting about mindfulness training is that you can actually train yourself to be more present. So it's something that you can learn. And what's been studied and published is a lot of centers are trying to use mindfulness training as a way to combat burnout. But the original studies that showed a benefit were really, really, really intense. So this was 8 to 10 weeks, 2.5 hours a day, plus an hour of homework every day, which is mostly meditation training. So it's very difficult to implement this without a lot of resources. And most of these courses are quite expensive, but there are some kind of simpler things that you can try to do. And there's quite a bit of data showing that mindfulness can have a positive impact on people's kind of overall well-being. It's been studied quite a bit in nurses and physicians, not so much in RTs. Hopefully we can do some studies in the future on RTs, but it does improve well-being and outcomes for. One of the things that we want to talk about is, we talk about gratitude, and I want to end kind of on these last 3 slides here is, we have to remember that at times our own light will go out and it can be rekindled by a spark from another person. So each of us has a cause to think with deep gratitude for those who have lighted the flame around us. I'm going to tell you a very brief story about Bob Kazmarek. So most of you probably know who Bob Kazmarek was. He passed away last April, but I was at the AARC presenting a poster presentation. The internal feedback I got was not very positive. So there wasn't a whole lot of support. It was you're just throwing numbers together. It really wasn't a very good experience. So I wasn't in a very, happy mind space, so to speak. And Dr. Kazmarek, and I didn't know who he was at the time, but he was moderating the forum, and we talked to him for, a few minutes, and he's like, hey, you really did a nice job. We're kind of seeing the same thing in our center. And that kind of always meant a lot to me because that was kind of a really nice boost to say, hey, you are doing a good job and you're capable of doing these things. And like he didn't know who I was, but that's the type of moment that a lot of us, especially if you're in a leadership position or a position of power, those little moments can kind of really make a big difference for. So in summary, burnout's where we're kind of unable to experience positive emotion. It's associated with all kinds of adverse outcomes for staff and patients. And there are some strategies that we can do to decrease burnout. And then it's always try to remember that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. So be kind always, from Robin Williams. Here's my contact information. There's my email. If you have any complaints or concerns or questions, you can follow me on Twitter. I only tweet about work. And then this link here will take you to the Duke Center for Healthcare, or I always say it wrong. They changed the name. The Duke Center for Healthcare Quality and Safety. And they have all of these amazing resources on their website, and they're all free. And most of them are smartphone based. So there's a lot of very helpful activities. I will send it back to Lexi.
Thank you, Andrew, for that very informative presentation. We will now share with everyone how they can obtain CEs for this session. This educational activity is approved for 1 contact hour. To obtain CE credits, go to www.saxtesting.com. You will need to register at the site. Complete the evaluation, and upon successful completion, you will be able to print your certificate of completion. Support for this educational activity has been provided by Philips. An archive on-demand version will be available on betteroutcomes.org. An email will be sent to all registrants when it is available. The on-demand version will be accredited for nurses and respiratory therapists. And now we have time for a few questions from our participants. I have a question from Jack. For you, Andy, is it appropriate to treat your burnout by quitting, retiring early, or finding a new career? Or is it more preferable to rough it out and find ways to make your job more interesting and tolerable?
Yeah, so that's probably a question I can't really answer because it's going to be different from person to person. I think one of the things that if you're suffering from burnout or you're having a really hard time is to really do some of those resilience activities. So like if you just do 3 good things, and it doesn't have to be at work, you can do it with your family, would be to start with those resilience activities and try to focus on the positive things that are happening at work. I know sometimes it can be very, very difficult to see those things, but there are more good things happen than you appreciate, probably, especially if you're burned out. I think that, if you've just had enough, you might want to consider getting some professional help from the employee assistance programs or a therapist before you just quit. But I think it's so hard to answer that question because it's going to vary so much from person to person. And the other thing is, you may not want to leave the profession. You may just want to find a different place to work that has a
Point. Thank you very much. We have another question here. In the HERO study, which profession had the highest COVID exposure?
it was the EMTs, and then respiratory was second, and we were very high, which was a little bit surprising for me because I figured it was going to be the critical care nurses, right? Because a lot of in our unit is still like that a lot. Our adult MICU is still often 90% plus COVID. You would have expected them to have the highest exposure, but it was actually the EMS folks.
I feel like this is a really good and relevant question here from Allison. Do you find that constant training of new staff and travelers has increased burnout as well?
So we don't have any data on that, but I think that's definitely a factor, right? So I think one of the challenges that we have is we are in the same boat as most places, right? So we're short staffed, so we're trying to hire people. And in the long term, that decreases the stress on the staff, right? But in the short term, it increases the staff. So if the stress on the staff. So if everyone's already burned out and you're suddenly dumping 15 new people on them, I work at a large facility, so we could potentially have those kinds of numbers. It actually increases the stress on the staff. So in the short term, it probably does increase burnout to have to constantly train new staff and train travelers, but we don't have any good data on that.
Another question we have is, has there been any research conducted on burnout in supervisors, managers, or maybe even directors?
Yeah, so those those populations were included in our prevalence study. I don't think that we reported them out separately, but I will say that being in a leadership position seemed to be protective in terms of burnout. And by leadership, I mean all the way up to where you don't have to take care of patients, don't take care of patients. And that's probably multifactorial. And I don't know the exact answers to that, but it's probably related to, maybe having more control over your hours and more control over your work processes, those types of things versus being at the bedside where you're, sometimes at a higher level of stress, but did not report those separately.
Okay, thank you. Here's another good question. So do you consider not being able to get away from, the horrible deaths that some respiratory therapists have seen through COVID out of your mind and still feeling emotional about them? Do you consider that something that contributes to PTSD?
So I'm not an expert on PTSD, but that sounds like PTSD to me. I think that one of the big challenges is that if you're really struggling with those things and you can't escape and it's kind of on your mind constantly, I think that's the kind of the space where you're in, where you really have to consider doing two things. One is, go to your bosses and say you're having this trouble, so you may need some time off. But then, that's a situation where you probably want to seek out some professional help to see if they can. The activities that I shared are probably not going to help you if that's the space that you're in. So I would highly recommend that you reach out to some professionals for help. And
I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Monica now for our concluding remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We thank you, and this does conclude our webinar for today. I would like to remind the audience that there is a survey for you at the conclusion that will pop up immediately, and we would greatly appreciate you sharing your opinions on today's webinar. We thank you again on behalf of our presenters, Sachs Healthcare Communications, and our sponsor, Philips. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.